It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the founder of happyfamilies.com.au and the co-host and parenting expert on Channel 9's Parental Guidance. Today, a conversation with Damien Cave about his brand new book. It's called Parenting Like an Australian. Parenting Like an Australian. One family's quest to fight fear and dive into a better, braver life. Damien Cave is a New York Times correspondent based in Sydney. He arrived in Sydney with one mission, and that was to make the Times awesome over here. Damien and his wife Diana were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting in 2008 with a team in Baghdad, where he covered the Iraq War. And like I said, he's been the Aussie bureau chief since 2017 here in Australia. The book, Parenting Like an Australian, is what we're going to discuss today. Damien, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with something that you may not have expected would be our jump-off point. But as I read the book, I saw so much, I just resonate so much with what you're saying because I'm an Australian and I love the ocean and I love surfing and the kids have done nippers and all the things that you're writing about. I'm so excited for you to be having these awful experiences, learning what makes Australian life so great. I wonder if you can start by sharing two epic failures that you write about in Parenting Like an Australian.
Only two?
just the first two that I want to pick on are your first surf lesson, how that came to be and why it was so bad and what happened as a result. And secondly, the first time you dived into the pool for a timed 400-meter swim, what that was all about, the history of that and why that went so badly.
Yes, happy to talk about both of those. So in the first case, and to some degree, this is the story of the book. It's me sort of following my wife and my kids into Australian life and me being kind of the one lagging behind. So with surfing, my wife got here from New York and just decided to dive in and started surfing before any of us taking lessons and getting into it. And of course, I figured, well, if she can do it, I should try it. And figuring it couldn't be that hard. My dad had been a surfer. We had tried surfing once before in Costa Rica. And if I recall, she managed to stand up that day and I did not. But undaunted, I went and had taken a lesson and just found it to be so thrilling to be a beginner and to just be laughing and falling over the place. And I completely looked ridiculous, I'm sure, not just in that first lesson, but in the second one and then the third one too. But in a weird way, I was able to just get just enough improvement to sort of relish the idea of being a beginner at something. And so, standing for even a split second felt good and felt like a triumph. And I don't know, I'm sure lots of your listeners have had this experience because I think it's pretty common among Australians, but I was learning to kind of be a child again and learn to kind of be a beginner again. And I was extremely grateful for that, even though it took me many, many years to go from that to being a somewhat decent surfer. So that was the first mistake and the first failure that led to, I guess, a period of joy. The second one was frankly more brutal, where after my son had been doing nippers for a year or two and, had a love-hate relationship with it, like a lot of kids, I think, was like, all right, Dad, I'll do it again, but you got to do it too. So get your bronze medallion and join me in the water. And, by this point, I'd seen other parents in the water. That part didn't seem that difficult, but like the idiot that I am previously with surfing, I don't really pay that much attention to what the details are. It turns out it's a timed swim of 400 meters. Some other American I know who had done it somewhere else said, oh, it's not that bad. Some you can do the breaststroke a little bit. The timing's not that much. And meanwhile, I'm doing it in Bronte in this really intense, dangerous beach with a bunch of surf club people who are very strict about such things. And so I dive in the pool thinking, and this is the pool in Bronte, right? It's 30 meters. So I have to do, I think, 14 laps. And literally by the second lap, I think I'm going to die. I realized that I've actually never tried to swim this far timed in my entire life. And so I don't know what I was thinking this would work. My goal was just to finish. And so by the time I finished, I think I needed to do it in 8:45 and I did it in almost 10 and a half minutes. And, Kimberly, who I later in the book, as you see, I've become friends with, tries to be encouraging and says, oh, well, your stroke seems fine. It's just fitness. But here I am in this pool, failing in front of all these people who are, in many cases, older and seem to be less fit than me, but still do a better job. And my son, who came down to watch me seemingly succeed and join him with nippers. And I have to leave as a failure and walk back home with him and deal with that. And, failure brings out good things maybe in us as parents and sometimes in our kids too. Like he was kind and sympathetic and in some weird way seemed to bond with me and my failure. Instead of dad being the one pushing him to go harder, he suddenly was the one trying to comfort me for failure.
Parenting Like an Australian is a book that is not so much about parenting, but it's more about us. At least that's the feeling that I've had as I've read through the book. Yes, there's a lot about what Australians do with their kids that's different to what you might see in middle-class America, especially places like New York, California. But as I've been making my way through this book, I'm actually seeing a story about a dad who is, I guess, flailing and trying to figure out how to have a healthy relationship with risk. Can you tell me about why you decided to write a book about taking risks and how parents in Australia do it differently to what you're familiar with in North America?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think my wife and I thought we kind of understood risk because, we'd covered wars, we'd covered hurricanes. And as journalists, we had experience with risk in a professional setting. But as parents, raising our kids in the United States and in Mexico for a bit, we were constantly struck by just how protective the culture was in the United States, where anytime you got kids near water or a certain kind of plastic or a certain food, there were concerns as if it was just going to ruin their lives completely. And we didn't realize that we had taken on some of those feelings. And so by the time we got to Australia, I was fascinated by the way that Australians deal with nature and the risks of nature. And these things that I didn't expect to be afraid of, like the ocean, but that I was for myself and for my kids. And what I guess it made me do was kind of try to clarify that experience of how risk works. Like I think I came in thinking, well, some people are risk takers and some are not. It's personality driven. But the deeper I got into it, in part because of my experience in Australia and being jarred by how scared I was, it made me really study the science and really kind of discover that actually, risk is more malleable, that it's not just personality, it's what we're taught, it's the culture we're around, it's the people that we're around, it's how much of it we actually embrace, and we can get better at it. And so that's the piece of it that I think was really what I found myself exploring. And you're right, I was flailing. And to me, part of it was trying to figure out why I was flailing when I had this impression of myself as being a risk taker. And yet there were certain kinds of risks that I was really bad at. And it wasn't just the ocean and nature, it was social risks, like joining things and being part of something in a way that Australians just take for granted. And so that was, I guess, what made me sort of explore this. And I think in the end, you're right. The book is in some ways about parenting, but it's really about parents and the way that we as adults live our lives. Because one of the things I think is underestimated sometimes in parenting and parenting books is it's not just about how we talk to our kids. It's what we do when we're around our kids. It's what we do when we're with our kids. And they learn a lot more from kind of watching us and being with us than they do from us lecturing them. And I think that's sort of what Australia and Australian life helped teach me, is that participating and being active and engaged as a parent and living your best life as a father in some ways can help you be a better dad.
One of the great things about reading a book by somebody who is a New York Times correspondent and bureau chief is the writing is fantastic. In the introduction, we're not even on a page number yet. We're still in the Roman numerals of the introduction. You write, in so much of Western culture, we've drifted into a cycle of self-centered self-protection. We seek physical comfort and total psychological security. We have prioritized attention, feelings, and speech, not good conduct. Our phones and algorithms promise connection but serve up isolation. Every day we choose convenience over uncertainty, overvaluing pleasure, and ignoring what being challenged has to teach. I love the way that you write, but I'd love to ask you, as you've been in Australia for now, 6 years or thereabouts, have you seen the Australian way of parenting drifting towards the American way of parenting? Do you think that we're becoming increasingly oriented towards self-protection and comfort and safety? Are we adopting the safety-ism that's so prevalent and so dominant in your home country?
I do think so. I've seen it kind of over the time that I've been here. And part of the reason I felt compelled to write the book is because I didn't want Australia to go too far down that road. And I wanted Australians to sort of, maybe with a little help from an outsider perspective, really grab onto the things that I think make the place special. I think as a country becomes wealthier, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this is the case beyond just my opinions, there's surveys and data around this, that as countries become more comfortable, they become more risk averse. That, as parents, we choose things that are safer. So We know that in Australia, fewer kids are walking to school now than they did, 10 or 20 years ago. But compared to the United States, there are still more kids walking to school here than there are in the US. And so that, in some ways, the way I think I describe it in some point in the book is, it's happening in Australia, but it's not quite a terminal illness like it is in the United States, both risk and connection and human connection. I think Australians, as we all retreat into our phones and as our digital lives become richer, it's harder and harder to push ourselves and our kids out into that in real life experience. But I do still think that Australians have not crossed the Rubicon. They haven't gotten to that point yet where it's very, very hard to pull themselves back. Whereas in a lot of parts of the US, I think they have. And so, that I think is the challenge. And maybe it's a bit of a wake up call for Australians to say, hey, keep sending your kids to bush camp, make them put their phones down, make them find a way to get out in the world and talk to their friends and not just retreat to their screens, because it's a better world that way. It honestly is.
On page 70, you quote a 2021 study, 185 parents. You say a majority of mothers and fathers said they believed that teaching their children the world was dangerous would keep them safe. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is sort of one of a bunch of different studies that I found that are somewhat counterintuitive, right? You think the natural urge and what's best for our kids is to say, hey, you need to be careful out there. The world is a scary place. But what that often does is make them more nervous and more anxious. And actually, optimism and a sense of, hey, it's going to be okay, is in some ways healthier for our kids. Because, even if you look at the probability, most of the time, that's how it's going to be. It's going to turn out okay. And in some ways, there are some cultures that maybe do a bit of a better job with this. I think Australia is one of them, but it's not just Australia. There was this interesting study that I found from Scandinavia that showed that kids who climb trees and suffer injuries, even broken arms, are less likely to be afraid of heights as they become adults. And so if you think about it, it is actually somewhat logical. If you expose yourself to things that are frightening, if you expose yourself to the dangerous world and then overcome whatever that challenge is and heal whatever injury you've had or don't get injured, which is usually the case, then naturally you have more confidence and more optimism about life, and you're probably going to embrace more challenges. And so, this is one of the things that the psychological research really, really shows that kind of goes against that natural parental urge. And so, sometimes as one, expert I talked to said, listen, if you don't have enough risk in your life, you actually need to go look for it, like for you and your kids. And you can't tell your kids to try to avoid risk all the time because it's not possible. It's an impossibility. And so you've got to figure out some way to confront it as adults and with your kids.
So I'm even having a thought as you describe that. And I'm thinking, we've got this idea, even using the word risk. I don't know if it's because of our history of insurance claims or the fact that there is so much that can go wrong, but we've got this idea that risk is bad. My sense is that risk is generally actually really healthy and it's essential to thrive. Like there's a risk when you invite somebody on a date. There's a risk when you try a new food. There's risk when you sign up for the musical and try to get a part in the musical at school, or when you run the cross country and decide that you're going to run hard because you want to place and move on to the next level. To me, it seems like we need to be encouraging our children to take risks.
Exactly. That's exactly right. A risk is inevitable. It's like oxygen. You can't try to get away from it. You have to figure out, how to breathe it in and digest it and make the most of it. And so, what's interesting too in the research is the people who are really experts in this, if you think of EMTs or soldiers, the ability to deal with risk in one environment and do it well can actually be transferred to other parts of life, right? So if you're really good at dealing with a stressful, risky situation, say you're a paratrooper, and there's a study that shows this, then when you take a test after that parachute jump, which is another, say, stressful environment, but maybe it's about English and literature and not paratrooping, you're more likely to do well on that test. And so the way that we deal with risk actually has long-term benefits, not just in the environment in which we take the risk, but also in the way we deal with life. And so you're right, learning how to deal with maybe saving a life on a beach might not seem the same as how to deal with a date and the stress that comes with that. But in a lot of ways, it actually is transferable. Something in our minds actually learns how to manage moderate stress and risk and danger in one arena, and then we get better at it in others.
Yeah, in the book, Parenting Like an Australian, one family's quest to fight fear and dive into a better, braver life. Damien Cave, you talked to Martin Seligman, one of the world's leading experts in psychology. He's one of the most cited psychology professors in the history of the world. He's obviously extremely well-renowned. And he makes the case both in conversation with you, as you put it into I think it's chapter 2 of the book, but also in his own books. He makes the case that we feel more confident, which is kind of what you're describing here. We feel more confident as we build our competence. The only way we can build our competence is to push the boundaries of what feels safe. Like we have to step into a risk environment one way or another so that we can expand our competence and therefore become more confident.
I mean, Marty's wonderful and he's such a thoughtful, kind guy. I mean, he's this, super renowned guy who you get him on the phone and the first thing he wants to do is ask you a bunch of questions about yourself. And so I always appreciate people who have that capacity. But, I think one of the things that he really opened my eyes to is this sort of reversal of sort of how I was raised as a kid, which is that, and to some degree, I think in this generation too, where it's if you say nice things, if you build up someone's self-esteem with words, if you say, hey, you're really great at this, then that gives you the ability to try and become competent in the activity that you want to seek mastery in. But as he argues, it's the opposite. You actually have to push yourself into that activity, even if you don't feel confident, and learn how to do it and get better at it and fail and try again and see some improvement. And then you start to feel confident enough to say, hey, I'm good at this. And that lasts longer. And in a lot of ways, I mean, for me, Australia was a place that I had to learn this through this word that I read about a lot in the book, which is proficiency, right? And so, I argue that Americans often seek perfection and Australians seek proficiency, which is really to be skilled at something. Being skilled at something isn't the same as being perfect at it. And in order to do that, you need to just advance. You just need to keep going and keep getting better at it. And I think that's kind of the point that Marty and many others have been trying to make for a lot of years, and that some parts of Australian culture just kind of naturally do.
I love the blistering critique that you have of the self-esteem movement and why it has not been a net positive for humanity, especially for parents who are trying to raise children who feel good about themselves. This idea that if I make you feel good, then you'll do hard things. It doesn't work that way. It's the other way around. If you do hard things, you'll feel good about yourself. When you came to Australia, you signed up for nippers, you signed up for surf classes, you began to move your body, run along the beach, dive into the pool and try to swim that 400 meters fast enough. I don't want to drop any spoilers in, so I'm not going to ask you whether or not you finally got the 400 meters under the 8 minutes 45 and whether you got your bronze medallion. But I do want to ask you this. Now that you've been here for 6 years and you are accustomed to the way that Australians do what they do, what risks are you taking over and above the ones that you've written about in the book? What are you doing to encourage a mindset that embraces challenge in your children? How have you extended this beyond nippers and bronze medallions?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, now that the pandemic has finally lifted, we're traveling quite a bit more as a family than we did previously. And so, we found ourselves in Japan skiing in January. My kids have skied once before in a total blizzard. And so that was one thing. We just recently finished a long road trip in Western Australia in a van, something that we had hoped to do in 2020 and we're finally able to do. And as luck would have it, there was a giant cyclone bearing down on us as we were driving. So, trying to manage risk, figuring out when to go in the water and when not to while in the middle of a remote area was another thing. And so I think part of it is we're trying to sort of push ourselves back out into the world is one way that we're trying to kind of continue that culture of risk. And I also think, frankly, after the pandemic, we all had to kind of reacclimate to the idea of risk in various ways. And so, one thing that I said to my kids at some point, maybe last year was, listen, this year, this is the year of yes. So whenever something comes up that you're not sure of, instead of thinking, no, I'm not going to do it, I'm nervous about it, let's just immediately try to say yes and then see where it goes. And so that's something that I think we're trying to do as a family, and hopefully we'll continue with it. And we'll see. Beyond that, each of my kids are doing different activities, different things they feel uncomfortable with. I'm about to throw my kids into a sculpture class that they're a little bit resistant to. And my wife and I are continuing to do the same things too. I mean, we're trying to push ourselves, on surfing into bigger waves. And, we're talking about where to spend time and how much difficult travel we want to do in the next year or two.
I love that. As a keen surfer, somebody who's been surfing since my teen years, I just relished your experiences at the beach and hearing about the way that you embraced what Australian life can be. It was delightful to read. And it's also inspired me to have a long conversation with my kids about how we can take more risks and be more adventurous, maybe even on a weekly basis. What can we do that's a little bit scary a little more often. The book is called Parenting Like an Australian, One Family's Quest to Fight Fear and Dive into a Better, Braver Life. It's got a whole lot of science, a whole lot of memoir, and a whole lot of delightful narrative that will keep any reader completely absorbed. Damien Cave, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon for Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For more information about the book, you can check out our show notes. The book again, Parenting Like an Australian, One Family's Quest to Fight Fear and Dive into a Better, Braver Life by Damien Cave. And for more about making your family happier, please check out happyfamilies.com.au or our Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families.